Coleman. She works with Sturgill, Turner, Barker, and Maloney in Lexington. She's an attorney there, and she does training for the City of Danville employees. She did it in August. We do it for our employees and our supervisors annually. So, want to introduce her, and I think she'll do a great job to do the training for you all, for elected officials.
I appreciate y'all asking me to come here today to go over some of the basics about discrimination and harassment in the workplace. And I'm going to try not to put my back to anybody. I can't stand in one place. I'm not one of those people. And unfortunately, I'm like in the spotlight if I go too many places here. So, but we will get moving. This is designed to talk to or address the general overview of discrimination and harassment in the workplace with a goal toward helping our elected officials to have a broad understanding of the issues that face our employees. It is not specifically designed supervisor or employee training, which we do also do. And I do know that there's a few folks that have come that are employees or supervisors within the county, and we're glad to have you aboard. But you might have some specific questions or things, and because of the role I have today, I really may not be able to answer those. But hopefully there'll still be a lot that you can gain from this process. Obviously, the reason that we do training, when we do it with the city, I don't know why he's going line by line there, is to increase knowledge about discrimination and harassment in the workplace. It's to make certain that we understand and can identify what the different forms of harassment are, how to prevent it, how to understand the negative impacts that certain behavior has on the workplace, whether it actually rises to the level of discrimination or harassment or not, and we'll talk about that. We identify means when we do our training to try to help supervisors and employees understand how to try to diffuse some of these situations that they run into, and we want to provide a guide for how we need to address discrimination and harassment in the workplace. So, why is it really important that we all know this? Aside from the fact that we know there's lots of attention on these matters, again, in our media and elsewhere in the United States, it is important. Harassment is a problem in the workplace. It creates low morale. It absolutely creates employee turnover. If employees are unhappy, they feel they're not being treated appropriately or fairly, we lose employees, and we don't want that to happen either. Employee turnover is costly. And also because claims, when we get them, whether they end up being successful or unsuccessful, are costly. Because people spend a lot of time with folks like me, which no one likes to do. No one likes to spend time with attorneys. We spend a lot of time in discovery, maybe we spend time in trial. It doesn't matter. Even when we are successful in a case, there is a cost to defending it, and it's not just a cost to the city or the employer. There is a cost to everyone involved, because as I said, there's a lot of time spent with attorneys, there's a lot of time spent focusing on what's going on, and it takes you away from your work, it takes your employees away from their work, it puts their focus and their attention on providing documents and information and other things to us as a part of our defense, all of which means they're not focused on providing services to the citizens of the city. So that's a problem. It's also an issue that, of course, the city has potential liabilities as an employer under the law. And the law addresses, for discrimination and harassment purposes, employer liability. So it's an employer-based liability. But interestingly, in Kentucky, there is also an employee and personal-based liability that can also come into play. So that is a significant issue. And often, and almost without fail, claims of discrimination and harassment include tort claims as well. And those tort claims will often, and will in most cases, sound as individual claims against individuals, not against the city themselves. So those could be any type of tortious conduct, anything from intentional inflictions of emotional distress to, it could be claims of assault, and those could be criminal and civil. They run both ways. They could be claims of defamation. We run into that a lot. So there's a lot of other things that come into play as well. So most folks, and I'm going to assume that most of you are part of the council, understand when we talk about employment at will. And most of us in the state of Kentucky are employees at will. Unless you have a contract of employment, you are an employee at will. And what that generally means when you're an employee at will is that you could be terminated at any time for any reason. It also means that employees can quit. So there's no obligation. You can't say because an employee came up and said, I'm telling you I'm quitting tomorrow or I'm quitting today. Well, you can't do that to me. Well, yeah, they can. You've made no promises to them either. They're an employee at will. That's why a lot of our policies say things like, if you give us 2 weeks notice, we'll pay out your vacation. Those are incentives to try to get notice because it's hard to replace an employee like that. We all know that. That's difficult. We need transition time, we need warning. Those things are helpful. But at the end of the day, even though we are an employment at will state, we cannot terminate someone for an illegal reason. So that could be anything from discrimination to filing a workers' comp claim, maybe making OSHA complaints. There's a number of things that would be protected activities that someone cannot engage in. And I'm just going to ask for any video or pictures. Some of what I use here, number one part of it's my copyright, it's not the city's, but I also have some things I'll be using that I license a right to use. So I can't have it videoed or copied. It'll even be a point when the public video will stop because I have some videos I have to show that I have a license agreement on and they can't be copied. So I'm just going to ask for that one. Thank you. Anyway, so we can't terminate folks for illegal reasons. And when it comes to the issues of discrimination and harassment, to say that you potentially terminated me for a discriminatory reason would be to say, for instance, in my case, well, you fired me because I'm old or because I'm a woman. I think that's most of what I fall into. There's probably some other categories. And that's all I have to say. That's all I have to say. And as a supervisor, a city, an employer, you have to come back and say, no, that's not why we fired Casey. We fired her because, she stole money or because she was, not doing her job. She was watching, Housewives of somewhere, I don't know, on her computer instead of working or something of that nature. We had a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for what we did. Then it becomes my burden to prove that that's not true. You really fired me for an improper reason. But the reason I point that out is I want you to understand how very easy it is for me to make you have to give a valid reason why you terminated me. And as far as I'm concerned, the bottom line is, if you can't articulate, and you can't document, and you can't support a reason for an employment action, it shouldn't be taken. And that's one of the reasons why the attorneys and human resources and those folks who are engaged in those functions are so on our supervisors to make sure that they document things, to make sure that we properly evaluate people, that we engage in appropriate disciplinary processes so that we can document issues should we have those. So, what is discrimination when we're talking about it? Well, it's under a large number of laws, actually, and all encompassed within Kentucky law as well. These are the areas that we prohibit discrimination. So we have age, which is age 40 and over. We have sex, which includes sexual harassment, and we're going to talk about that separately. National origin, disability, veteran status, color, race, religion, also genetic information in this day and age, and in Kentucky, smoker status. And that is a vestige in the Kentucky statute from the fact that we used to be one of the largest tobacco producing states in the Union. So we protected that significantly. That is much diminished since that statute was enacted and on this basis. We now recognize that on the basis of what we call the public health, welfare, and safety, we can limit, control, or designate areas as non-smoking. And that is appropriate and that is legal. So a workplace, public buildings, other things can be non-smoking. That is not a form of discrimination in Kentucky. What would be discriminatory in Kentucky would be to say, I'm going to fire you because you smoke. Or to say, you won't be considered for this promotion because you smoke. That is an impermissible consideration in Kentucky. So, when we're talking about harassment today, and I'm going to talk about sexual harassment, but we're talking about harassment, and it's not just sex. So when we're talking about harassment, the EEOC defines it as any type of unwelcome conduct where enduring the offensive conduct becomes some sort of condition of your continued employment. You have to put up with comments or actions that are considered offensive or harassing. The conduct is severe or pervasive enough to create a hostile work environment. that a reasonable person would consider hostile, and we'll talk about the reasonable person standard. Any type of retaliation for filing a charge or a claim of discrimination, for testifying or participating in any proceeding or investigation into a claim of discrimination, and for vocally opposing any type of employment practice that you or an individual believes it creates a discriminatory impact or effect. So, where are we with awareness? Well, awareness is significant. And our focus as a nation right now seems to be on sexual harassment more than anything else. But awareness is still significant. And to understand the impact, in 2018, you can see there were just over 27,000 charges of harassment. This is not sexual harassment, filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And of those, 670 came from Kentucky. And you can see part of the breakdown that we've had. You can file with the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights if you're in Fayette County, the Fayette County Commission, or you can file with the EEOC. Filing with the EEOC usually dually files you with both, but that is the process that we have. If you'll note, over 134 million benefits were paid through negotiations with these agencies. This is not actions in litigation based on claims of discrimination or harassment. So it is a costly issue. So when we're talking about harassment, general harassment, we're talking about things like offensive slurs based upon one of those characteristics that we've laid out as prohibited areas of discrimination, name calling, obviously physical assaults or any type of physical threat, which is not only a violation of the discrimination laws, but clearly a criminal violation as well. Intimidation, offensive objects or pictures, anything that impermissibly interferes with the work performance in the workplace. So where we see these sorts of things occur, well, people say things directly to someone. Although sometimes folks are a lot smarter than that. Instead, we talk to others. You know, rumor, innuendo, inappropriate comments behind someone's back, but they really aren't. People are aware that those comments are occurring. On the phone, email. We are always trying to educate our employees that email is not casual conversation. And it's very simple for folks to think that, oh, I'm just going to pull up this email. And if it's someone you're very comfortable with, someone you work with all the time, or someone who's a good buddy besides your workplace relationship, the tendency to want to talk like it's conversational can be great. But unfortunately, little slips of the tongue within that can become a problem. Like, boy, I'm really having a tough time with this new employee. They just don't understand this technical side of stuff. They're like, a little old man in the fast lane doing 30. Well, that sounds an age discrimination. I know what the frustration is that was trying to be expressed, but that sounds an age discrimination. So that's a problem. We also have a significant issue these days with social media. People like to say things on social media. I always tell every employee, because it's not just supervisors, it's generally, I can sue my coworker for discrimination. So I say, if you've had a really bad day at work and you're really frustrated with someone, don't go home and get on your Facebook or your whatever and go, oh my God, Get on your Facebook and say, boy, was today awful. I'm glad I'm home. Get off. Get a drink, have a beer, have a glass of wine, bitch at your wife, your husband, kick the dog, I don't know, but don't do it on social media. That's just not a smart thing to do. So, but people, they want to live their lives out on social media. And all of that, as the lawyer, I will tell you, all of that is discoverable. All of it. If there are comments made and they're in those contexts, we will find them, we get them. And I'm a defense attorney. They still get found. That's one of the first things we have to engage in is securing electronic media and producing from those forms. And that will reach to personal media if you commented on things that impact on the claims that are made. So it's a big issue these days. So I also want to make sure we understand, and this is an issue that we deal with regularly. When we are talking about harassment under the law, and we're talking about what I call inappropriate conduct, employees often have complaints about where I would deem inappropriate conduct, but it's not discrimination or harassment. It actually is a fairly high bar, not terrible, but it's a fairly high bar to become statutorily prohibited discrimination or harassment. But it doesn't mean that the conduct's not inappropriate in the workplace. So as a workplace, just because something might not be illegal harassment doesn't mean it's not conduct that we need to address. And ignorant or inappropriate conduct can become discrimination or harassment, because if it is constant, if it's repeated, it may then have an impact of nonetheless creating an offensive working environment. So this is where we talk about just not, as it's noted, petty slights, annoyances, those sorts of things are not illegal harassment. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about some of the bullying legislation here in a minute, but this is an issue that we deal with a lot. But it doesn't mean at the end of the day, you're not defending a claim, dealing with an EEOC complaint, or something that is not going to go anywhere because it's not illegal harassment or discrimination, but it was still inappropriate conduct. So why are we dealing with this, and why do we tolerate that conduct? And those are things we still need to try to address. And because what we often are talking about is what I call the equal opportunity jerk. The person in the workplace who's kind of a jerk to everybody, or, always makes comments that are, just, they're not racially offensive or age discrimination or gender discrimination, but they're just offensive. And that shouldn't be allowed. And there used to be, well, so-and-so, they just ignore them. Well, we shouldn't have to ask our employees to ignore someone who's engaging in conduct that is inappropriate in the workplace. And what we have done, let me go back to that, is we are seeing a lot of states adopting legislation addressed at bullying in the workplace. And I'm only going to touch on this briefly. Kentucky has not adopted it. Interestingly, Tennessee has, which I would not have expected. I'll be honest with you. California, I expect them to do all this stuff, okay? I don't expect, the South and some of the heartland areas and all that to necessarily jump on these legislations. Because to me, what this is, and this is what I find frustrating, they're legislating common decency and appropriateness. They're saying you should treat people with respect. Why? It's frustrating to me to think that we have to legislate that. Okay? Now in Tennessee, this only applies to state employees, but there's movement afoot to maybe expand that into the private sector as well. But there is this model legislation out there. And so I bring that to your attention just because it is frustrating. And while Kentucky courts so far and everything that they do, they still stick to the original Supreme Court issued mantra that is, we're not here to legislate the general workplace. We're not, the petty annoyances and slights and that comes from Supreme Court language. That's not what we're here. We're not here to police that part of the work environment. But there is a growing expectation that people aren't going to be treated in a disrespectful manner in the workplace, even though that's not necessarily rising to the level of discrimination or harassment. The other thing that there's a lot more discussion on is the idea of unconscious bias or unconscious thought and action in the workplace. And the idea that research indicates that there are things that we do and ways that we act that they're not a part of our conscious thought. They're kind of inbred as a part of our backgrounds, our knowledge, our experiences, and yet they can have an impact that can be inappropriate. So, related to that, I would, for instance, going back to our oldest and most ingrained issue of equality, the battle of the sexes. And if you think, particularly for those who are old, there's another area of stereotypes that people typically put with men. And I do think a lot of this, and when I do training with younger folks, so see, we are getting discriminatory, they don't pick up on some of these as much, but the idea that they were strong, they're analytical, they're leaders, they're decisive, they're articulate. These are terms that we would use to describe men, and women are typically described more as caring or organized but temperamental, maybe gossipy, or, you know, a bitch. You know, so a man who's aggressive, assertive, is a strong personality. A woman who's aggressive and assertive is a bitch. And I think that we are moving away from that, but those are issues that we have always dealt with. So, the problem with that is because we carry some of those assumptions with us, sometimes we have misconceptions. We make judgments on people based on things that are not a part of our experiences with them, but a part of our natural assumptions. We all do. I mean, there's an extent to which every one of us has to admit, when you first meet someone, you make some immediate judgments and assumptions about them based on how they're dressed, how they look. You know, there are things that we do make assumptions on. And those can lead to potential issues of discrimination. The way to try to understand this is to think about going to a meeting or an event where you really don't know people and how you behave. You know, if you were a guest to someone and you didn't know other people, or this is, you know, the first time you're being brought home to meet the family, or whatever you're going to do, we're on our best behavior. We're conscious of how we react to things. We're conscious of what we say, how we speak. We think before we speak. But when we are in very comfortable environments, those protections fall away. And luckily, our comfortable environment in many cases is work. You know, hopefully our employees are comfortable at work and they are relaxed with their coworkers, but because those the protections of thinking and stopping and wondering if you're going to say something that might be offensive to someone disappears, and then all of a sudden we are doing that without any intention to do so. And what I think is interesting is that a lot of what we really deal with is, and I think I've got a slide, I'm probably jumping ahead of myself, what they call affinity bias. It's not that you're biased against anyone, but we have a tendency to be biased in favor of those who are most like us. Because that's kind of the way our whole lives live to some extent. You know, you go to church with certain people, you grew up in a certain neighborhood, I mean, there are things that are familiar and comfortable, and if someone falls into what's familiar and comfortable, we're more relaxed and more accepting of that person. And it doesn't mean that we're doing it intentionally. It's unintentional, but we nonetheless do it. So one of the things that I would ask you to think about is if I said to you, I need you to pick someone or two people to whom you have to entrust a dire task. It's a life or death issue. It's very important, and you have to rely on this person exclusively to do this, or to maintain an important secret or important information. And it can't be your spouse or your son or your daughter or a family member. Who would you pick? I want you to think about who you would select to do that task. And then my question would be for the women, how many of you picked another woman? For our men, how many of you picked a man? That's because, again, it's an infinity bias. We see ourselves. So when, you know, it's natural that we feel comfortable relying on our spouse or our child. That's why we take that out of the equation. But we tend to go to us. We reflect us when we're looking for someone with whom we trust with a task like that. So we just talked about the infinity or in-group bias, so I'm not going to go over that again. But I would suggest that you make note of the Harvard bias test, and you don't have to know that explicitly, that website. If you just remember Harvard bias test, that's all you need to know. If you will put that in on any search engine on the internet, you will come up with the Harvard bias test. And it is a long-term project being done by Harvard, which tests the idea of unconscious bias. And there are a number of categories that you can choose to take a bias test. And it's set up a very specific way, and I encourage you to try it. And I encourage you to try one or two tests that you know you're not biased. For instance, there is no way I was biased against women, okay? Particularly because I'm more that generation that fought their way into certain areas in the workplace, okay? Guess what? I got a little bias against women. But you know why? I'm the June Cleaver generation though too, okay? Mom is home and hearth and nurture and all those things. So that comes through when you take one of these bias tests. Things you don't think about. I definitely didn't think I would have a bias against older people. Because I definitely have reached that age where I say, well, you know, this generation now. I do. It's slight, but I do. So it's interesting to do these and see where you actually will find that you do. And I had one partner who said, oh, I didn't really end up with that. And I said, then you thought too much when you did it and you tried to trick the test. Don't. Because I think if we're all being honest with ourselves, we have some bias. And having a little bias isn't a bad thing. It's acting on a bias that's a bad thing. But it is natural. So the issue that we're really running into though now with unconscious bias is if it is something that perpetuates itself or somehow shows itself. For instance, let's say that because through affinity bias, I tend to, think when I get an interesting case or an interesting brief to write, I go to my young female associate and ask her to work on it because, she reminds me of me. Well, my young male associate might feel that I'm discriminating against him because I'm not giving him the same opportunities, and that was never my intention. But that's what I did. And so the EEOC is now saying that unconscious bias can be intentional discrimination. And it sounds like an oxymoron because we're saying if it was unconscious and not knowing, how is it intentional? But what they're saying is, but the impact can nonetheless be discriminatory. So it's, we are coming to a point where we need to think about these issues of unconscious bias. And unconscious bias also can be those coworkers that speak without thinking and sometimes cause offense to other people. And while it's not maybe illegal, it's still inappropriate, and we need to nip it in the bud, as I think some TV character used to say. So, we talked about bullying already, and this is some of the examples of what is set forth in the legislation that I've mentioned. It's things like constant and unfair criticism, excluding or isolating people, not giving people credit for their work, setting someone up for failure, yelling, shouting, and screaming, hostile glares, intimidating gestures, overt threat. We should not tolerate any of this in the workplace. This is why when I look at some of this, I think, why are we legislating this? Why is this just not acceptable? So, I would hope that we would all agree that that shouldn't happen. I mean, those things shouldn't happen in the workplace. And if someone has a complaint about that, we need to try to address those problems. So, and you'll have to excuse us, we go a little bit of back and forth here. And this is one point when I get to point out that I need to not record since this is my license.
So I've been told, but I can't understand what she has to complain about. I mean, she has a front row seat as I make scientific history, but there's string cheese in my mini fridge, and that's for anyone. Yes, and just yesterday, I led her away from a life of sexual promiscuity by making her look at pictures of disease-ridden genitalia.
Cancel my next appointment. This is going to take a while. Dr. Cooper, you said things to your employee that you just cannot say in the workplace.
Like what?
Well, according to Ms. Jensen, you said that she was a slave to her biological urges and called her an egg salad sandwich. I don't even know what that means, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you you can't say it.
Oh, I see the confusion here. No. Alex thought I was singling her out. No, I meant that all women are slaves to the and even you. You're a slave.
I'm a what?
I'm just saying, at a certain point in a woman's menstrual cycle.
Not that either, Dr. Cooper. Your language is entirely inappropriate, and I'm going to advise that you shut your mouth right now.
Yeah, I don't see why I'm the one being persecuted here. Dr. Hofstadter, he was bragging bragging about his sexual desirability to anyone who would listen. You know, and Howard Wallace, he spent 2 years using university resources building a 6-breasted sex robot. This Christmas party, I heard Rajesh Koothrappali refer to you several times as brown sugar.
What's that? Wallowitz, and the last one was Rajesh Koothrappali?
You know, yeah, but in his defense, that wasn't racist. He's also brown.
Anybody watch The Big Bang Theory? No. All right, so you know the Sheldon is the epitome of a rocket scientist who has no social clues or abilities whatsoever. And when that episode came out, for someone that does train, it was like manna from heaven to get this clip, because he couldn't hit on any more cylinders than he does in terms of being offensive and having absolutely no intention to do it. He's absolutely clueless about it. So, and it's hard. You know, when we do these trainings, it's also serious. So you like it when we have something that's a little bit of levity. But we don't want any Sheldons. So when we're talking about sexual harassment, we are talking about unwelcome, unwanted behavior that's sexual in nature. It's requests for sexual favors, sexual or physical contact, anything under 2 different circumstances. One is when it is made a condition of your employment. It's implicitly or explicitly a term or condition of employment. This is what we call quid pro quo harassment. This is Harvey Weinstein. Okay? This is, if you sleep with me, honey, you'll get the role in the movie, and if you don't, I'm going to blackball you in this industry and you'll never work again. That is what we're talking about. For years, I would do training now, and I would say, you know, we just don't see a whole lot of quid pro quo harassment. People aren't that stupid anymore. Well, yeah, they are. So we're back to talking about this. The other is when we're dealing with conduct that has the result of unreasonably interfering with the work environment. It's something that creates a hostile work environment. It's comments, innuendo, jokes, not one, really not even 2 or 3, but a pattern of conduct that is offensive and creates an uncomfortable working environment. So, I started off that definition with unwelcome. And unwelcome is a key necessary element of there being harassment. So, when Harvey Weinstein, and we've had more stuff with Matt Lauer out now, and I'm trying to think of who else, what is the first thing, when they issue a statement, or their talking heads issue a statement, what is the first thing they say in their defense? It was consensual. This wasn't harassment. This was a consensual relationship. I think Matt Lauer just issued, this wasn't rape, it was a affair, a consensual affair. Why do they say that? Because if it was welcome, it wasn't sexual harassment. So the problem when we have power differentials and when we talk with supervisors, what we want them to understand is, I don't really care if it was consensual. If they claim it wasn't, and you had power or authority, no one's going to believe you, including a jury. So it's a dangerous scenario, and it's one of the reasons why we don't like to have people supervise spouses or even children or someone that they're in a relationship with. And the reality is, kind of like that affinity bias, you probably will have someone who was supervised by a family member or someone they're in a relationship with claim that they are treated more harshly because that person tries so hard to prove they're not being biased that they treat me worse. And yet, the reality is we have there's always going to be the perception of favoritism or the perception that it wasn't welcome. So those are always concerns. Interestingly, the number of workplace harassment complaints has been obviously increasing over the last 15 years, but in the last decade, we were actually seeing a decline until we got Harvey, okay? Now, I don't have all the figures coming back in, but I can assure you it's definitely on the rise again. The Me Too movement has really brought this forward. The last time this really came forward significantly was the Anita Hill hearings. And you gotta be old again, like me, to remember that now. I mean, I'm getting to where I do these classes and I want to use Bill Clinton as an example, and people don't know who Paula Jones was, so I'm really feeling that, okay? But these are things that we deal with. So, as you can see, in 2018, there were 13,000 charges of sex-based harassment that were filed with the EEOC, and just over 7,000, well more than 7,000 were sexual harassment. And even though, and we'll talk about this again, sexual harassment is not just male to female harassment. 84% of those claims were made by females. From 18 to 17, there was 1,000 more charges, and that is directly related to Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too movement and everything that's been going on. And you look at the damages that have been paid out through conciliation with the EEOC or these agencies, not through claims and litigation. And it's over $56 million. This is a costly venture. So these are things that we don't want to deal with. One of the biggest issues you run into is, well, when is it sexual harassment? You know, you're asked that all the time. And at the end of this, I'm going to show you another video, and they're going to talk about flirting, and that flirting is kind of a small sexual advance, and it is to some extent. But it's not unwelcome attention. Okay? Flirting usually goes both ways. It makes someone feel good about themselves because they're getting a compliment. You don't feel like you don't have control. That's all right. But when it's harassment, then we're talking about comments or touching or things that make someone uncomfortable. You know, it's one-sided. It's not a give and take between two people, and the person feels powerless to manage that situation. I had a case once where, because how many of you have hugged a coworker?
Have what?
Hugged a coworker? Is hugging a coworker sexual harassment? No. No. Now, I have worked with some folks who are very particular about their personal space, and I would not hug them. And part of that goes into paying attention. You get verbal cues, or non-verbal cues. I mean, if I touch someone who doesn't like to be touched, they're probably going to pull back. So that told me, don't touch me. If someone does that, don't touch them. Okay? They told you. They didn't tell you, but they told you. But I've hugged a coworker. Something wonderful has happened, some great event in their life, and that's so wonderful, and you give them a hug. Or something tragic has happened, and you give them a hug, and you tell them how sorry you are. That's not harassment. But I had a case once where the young ladies who had a complaint against a supervisor told me that their supervisor would give them a hug and a rub. And in a very short phrase, she said, ick. That's what she said. This does not pass the smell test. A hug and a rub. I knew exactly what she meant. This was not a hug. It was a feel. And it was inappropriate. And I loved that. I hate it happened to them, but I loved that, the way she put it. Because it so succinctly conveyed what was happening, and it wasn't a hug. And so that's what we are dealing with. Let me get all these up so I can quit going back and forth. Come on. So when we're talking about sexual harassment, we're always talking about unwanted, unwelcome behavior. And it's usually going to be repeated behavior. You know, telling a sexual joke, it's not appropriate, but is telling one sexual harassment? No, it's not. It's inappropriate behavior. You know, it's usually going to be repeated. If someone is touched, if someone is propositioned, you need to sleep with me to do this, if you're touched in a sexual way, that's sexual harassment. That's the do not pass go. It definitely is. And it's also, if it involves touching, it's more than just a violation of civil statutes. So, despite everything that we hear, and despite Harvey Weinstein and Me Too, and all the stuff, and the Kavanaugh hearings, and everything in the world that's gone on, the vast majority of people who are being harassed don't want anything to happen other than they want it to stop. And after nearly 30 years of practicing in this area, I'll tell you that is very true. True victims of sexual harassment are confused, they're uncertain what they did to make someone think that the behavior was acceptable. I must be doing something wrong. Harassers know how to choose their victims. And they will not going to choose the person who's going to give them a swift uppercut, okay? They're going to pick on the person who they know they can get away with that behavior. And often by the time someone comes forward, it's been going on for quite a while. And we tell our supervisors, and we tell you in your positions, if an employee of the city comes to you and says, I really want to talk to you about something, but I don't want you to do anything. That's really not the response, and it's not their fault. I've had victims say, well, I didn't want them to get fired and lose their job because, you know, they have a family. I understand that, but it's not acceptable. They can't engage in that behavior. So we still have obligations. Our supervisors have obligations to report on any report of discrimination or harassment. I also make that little note that a lot of people who offend or harass will stop when they're told. And this becomes that coworker that we've all worked with who, you know, doesn't think before they open their mouth and they make comments or tell jokes or use little comments that you just kind of go, I can't believe they used that comment in mixed company. And we are beyond the time when we can say, oh, that's just so-and-so. Just they say that to everyone, just ignore them. That doesn't work anymore. If it's constant, if it's regular, it can rise to the level of discrimination or harassment, and it needs to stop. And so we encourage everyone, you need to speak up. If you have a coworker or you have a fellow official or someone that you are working with who engages in comments that maybe they shouldn't, you need to give them that nudge that says, hey, don't do that. You might be offending people. And they really aren't meaning to offend anyone. They're shelving, okay? They're not getting it. That wasn't their intention, but it doesn't matter. It still could end up with a complaint. So, then the other, of course, is what is sexual harassment? You know, I might think that's inappropriate and someone else doesn't. I mean, and I'll use the Sheldon clip as an example. What we as a society find acceptable is a sliding scale. Do you think some of the language that was even in that clip you would have heard for those of us who are, again, of a certain age on TV in the 80s or the 90s? No. I mean, again, back to June Cleaver, when on the Dick Van Dyke Show, they didn't even sleep in the same bed. They had a bedroom and they each had twin beds, okay? You know, because married people don't sleep in the same bed. I mean, the things that were taboo and that we didn't do or talk about changed. And what has become commonplace has changed. And whether we like that or not, it moves the scale. And it changes what society considers offensive or acceptable. And I don't know, from my standpoint, hopefully some of what we are now experiencing, maybe it'll slide the scale back. But again, I'm old, so I don't like all this new stuff. So we will see, but that does make a difference. So we are talking about what a reasonable person in society would find offensive. So we're not talking about the Sheldons who don't get a clue. And we're also not talking about someone who's overly sensitive to everything. That's not a reasonable reaction either. So it's somewhere in the middle, and there is no bright line except I can tell you, saying sleep with me or you won't get this role is definitely sexual harassment. The last thing that's really important to remember is that harassers do come in all shapes and sizes. As I said, they know how to pick their victims, but also more importantly, they're well hidden. Either they have power and influence, like Harvey Weinstein, because I think probably most of the women around here, when he says it was all consensual, they all go, but they're not always. Sometimes they're. I mean, oh gosh, no, my mind is not like the guy that just killed himself.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Epstein, not a bad-looking guy. He was rich and powerful. You could believe that women were more than happy to throw themselves on him because they thought they might advance themselves. Who knows whether that's right or wrong? Okay. But that's how they get away with the behavior. And they often are well-liked, well-respected people. So that if someone comes to you and says, hey, so-and-so is engaging in this behavior, the response is, oh, they wouldn't do that. Or you would think someone who has too much to lose, like Weinstein or, you know, surely you wouldn't be that stupid But people are that stupid. So we can't be dismissive of a complaint. We have to at least look into it and investigate it. So if someone in your role comes to you and tells you that something inappropriate is going on, you need to report that to officials with the city who can then look into that and investigate it. So, just so we're clear, even though we pretty well covered this, we're talking about offensive remarks about someone's body or their clothing, you know, complimenting someone. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, that's a sharp suit, really nice today. That's a compliment. Saying, I really love the way that blouse kind of hugs those curves. That's an inappropriate comment. I think we can make the distinction, I hope. What about putting up a picture of cartoon figures that's sexual in nature? Do you think that's a problem in the workplace? Yeah, it doesn't matter if it's stick figures or it's actual people. If it's sexual, it doesn't belong in the workplace. It's sexual. How does anybody in your roles, do you have private offices where you work, or anyone here have a private office? Does your coworkers come in your office? Your supervisor? Subordinates? Cleaning crew? Empty that wastebasket? None of us have private offices. None of us. They are areas where we interact with people and people come on a regular basis. So it's never going to be appropriate to display something that's sexually suggestive or offensive or sexual in nature in our offices. Obviously, requests for sexual favors, the introduction of sexually explicit material into the workplace without a work-related purpose. I'll reach beyond, because I know I've got some sheriffs over here. Can they deal with that? Absolutely, they could. And it's not sexual harassment. Unfortunately, they may deal with some very horrific things that are sexual in nature. It's a part of crimes and it's part of their job. But that is not sexual harassment. They don't have images or information with the intention to intimidate or titillate or offend someone. It's a part of their job. It also, I could be a faculty member at center and teach art history, and I'm probably showing images of naked people in pictures and in paintings and in statuary, but again, it's not for sexual harassment purposes. It's an educational purpose behind it. So that's not an introduction into the workplace without a work-related purpose. So when we talk about who can commit sexual harassment, really it's everybody. And that's one of the reasons it's important for us to help all of you, including our elected officials, understand what we deal with. Yes, supervisors, yes, subordinates or coworkers can engage in harassment, but it can be customers, residents, visitors, third-party agents, people who we do business with or who provide services to the city. Any type of vendor or contractor can also engage in harassment. The question becomes, what do we do about it as an employer? And as an employer, if an employee tells us that someone is harassing them, we have an obligation to address that. We have no control, disciplinary or termination or whatever, over someone who's not our employee. But it doesn't mean that we don't take steps to ensure that the employee is not being subjected to the harassment. So if a vendor is engaged in inappropriate conduct, we would report that to the vendor and say, we have complaints about one of your individuals. That's for them to deal with that person. But our response might be, we don't want that person delivering to us. And if they still show up, we're going to tell the employee, if they show up on our premises, you get to walk away and go get someone else to deal with them. You don't have to deal with them. We control what we can control. But we do need to respond to it to make sure, at least on our premises, they're not being subjected to that behavior. We also like to touch on, particularly with our supervisors, to help them understand some of the things that impact and increase or like a greater potential for there to be issues in the workplace. And some of the things that they focus on that can create a greater likelihood of occurrence is composition of the workforce. I mean, naturally, there are some jobs, not so much necessarily what we deal with here, but there are some employers I deal with who deal in industries that are predominantly male versus female. And actually, this is still one based on the local city government statistics would tend to indicate is still the case in city government. We particularly see it in service industries and other, when we deal with our highly technical industries. Unfortunately, we still see a power differential between males and females. We also can see distinctions based on race status or on national origin status or other things. We don't run into that as heavily here in Kentucky, but it's a significant issue in larger cities and other areas, particularly when we deal with national origin. Obviously, when there are significant power differentials, that comes into play because that's where people benefit and get away with the conduct because people have a fear of making reports for fear of what will happen to their jobs. And we particularly see this, which is not a significant factor for you all, but for those for whom language is an issue, for whom English is a second language, they particularly because of cultural background issues, the idea that they aren't allowed to complain about those in positions of authority over them or that they're supposed to tolerate or accept it. We see it also because it's not just that we educate or we try to educate those individuals that this is not acceptable here. You can make a complaint. You should make a complaint. Even while we're telling them that, if they work in industries that are heavily, involved with immigrants who are English as a second language, their own community outside of work will retaliate against them for making a complaint in many cases because they see it as you've raised this issue, you've made a complaint, you've caused a problem, you will cause a problem for all of us, and we're now all worried about our jobs. So it's very hard to overcome those issues and try to encourage employees that you do need to speak up if there's a problem. Obviously, if we have individuals working in isolation, that makes it much easier for people to engage in behavior. There's less folks to see it, to have a corrective response. Lack of knowledge of rights, as I said, and that fear of retaliation is one of the key elements that we deal with. Again, with Sheldon as our example, it just doesn't matter. I know that his intentions were noble. He intended to, save her from a life of sexual promiscuity. I mean, how much more noble can you be? But the impact was offensive, and it was discriminatory, and it was harassing, and it's not acceptable in the workplace. And we all know that Sheldon didn't mean to do that. I don't think Sheldon would know how to sexually harass someone, but that's what he did, okay? So this became a problem. And it doesn't matter. If a reasonable person, which the assistant was a reasonable person, would perceive his comments as offensive and inappropriate, that's all that matters. So that's why Sheldon found himself in the hot seat, and then throwing all his buddies under the bus as well. And we do want people to speak up in the workplace. We encourage them that they need to. We try to educate our employees that it's not acceptable to say, well, that's how this has always been, or that's the way this person's always behaved. To think that no one will listen, because someone will listen. There are a lot of avenues and options, and people within the city can go to any member of management and speak to them. We hope that people don't, again, fall into I don't want to get in trouble. You will not get in trouble for making a legitimate complaint of discrimination or harassment. And oftentimes, we get into the, maybe it's not you, maybe it's somebody else. Still speak up. Maybe they are so afraid of speaking up, they're not saying anything. But if you see inappropriate behavior, you speak up. You say something. You bring it to someone's attention. It's all our responsibility. It's not just a responsibility to say, well, if they're not going to complain about that conduct, then why would I complain? It's still inappropriate. No one should have to put up with it, and again, we should not overlook anyone's behavior just because of who they are or what they do. So we encourage our employees, if they are being subjected to any type of discrimination or harassment, to speak up, to say something. We always say, say something. If someone offends you, say it. Because maybe they are that person who didn't mean to be offensive. And if they realize they've offended you, they very well may stop. But no one is obligated to confront someone or say something to someone they feel is discriminating or harassing against them. they have the right to go to someone within the city and ask that they address that behavior. And when we talk to our supervisors, we tell them that it is very important that they know the policies, which is one of the reasons we engage in this training, that we never ever tell someone to ignore someone's behavior. You know, like at Sheldon, it's just Sheldon. You know, that doesn't work. We can't promise that confidentiality. You know, if I'm going to talk to you, I want to tell you this, but you got to promise me you're not going to tell anyone. You can't do that because we do have an obligation to report that on and to investigate and to look into any complaint. And we need our supervisors to let those who engage in that know. We need them to notify Dawn or notify others who are engaged in that process. Because we want to get them involved. And I explain to our supervisors often, someone may have come to you not because you're their direct supervisor. They came to you because your kids play soccer together, or you go to the same church, or you know they live down the street and they know you, they're comfortable with you. So I can tell you this, but we still have an obligation to make a report of that, no matter what our relationship is when they come to us, and that includes if they come to us at the backyard barbecue and tell us about discrimination or harassment at work. It doesn't matter that you weren't at work when they told you about it. You still need to make a report. And then I tell them, maintain the person's trust and confidence, which sounds so inconsistent with saying, well, I'm not going to keep this confidential. But it is. We are not going to go get on that email and say, oh my God, you're not going to believe what so-and-so just came in and told me. You know, or go to the proverbial water cooler and have a conversation about this. That is not appropriate. Maintaining confidence means I'm only going to tell those who need to know to address this. But I'm not going to say nothing. And I tell our supervisors too, saying nothing, even though you think that's what this person wants and it's what they're begging you to do, their attorney doesn't feel the same way. And when they file the lawsuit, it's going to say, I went to so-and-so and they didn't do anything. Because they know that you were supposed to. So I know, and it's hard. I've talked to supervisors who said they just begged me not to do it. They said they just couldn't, they just didn't want anyone to know about this. I understand that. And I understand how hard it is to look at someone, but sometimes you have to say, I can't promise you I won't tell someone, because it's no different. And the way I try to say, to explain this, it's no different than if you came to me and said this person was stealing money from the city. Do you think that you could reasonably ask me to not say that? It's no different. And your obligations are no different. Well, I didn't tell anyone that they were stealing money because they asked me not to. That doesn't sound logical. So why does it sound logical just because we're talking about sex? Yeah, it doesn't change the situation. And it's important that we understand the need to get people involved. So again, let's say someone came to me because they're comfortable with me. So me saying, oh, you know, you really need to tell somebody else about this. Well, I wasn't comfortable going, we need to go talk to someone, you know, over in this department or whoever's designated for doing their investigations. Well, I don't know them, but you do. So if they come to you, you need to say, you know, let's go down the hall, or let's go down the street or whatever and go see Donna, or go see whoever it is that you all have involved in that process. Bring them in, say, hey, this person, I think they need to talk to you. Help them make that connection, because then you can get out of it. They'll move you out of the investigation and they'll deal with the investigation, but help them make that connection. You know, when we work with really large companies, and people say, well, you need to go to HR. Well, you know, most people saw HR the day they started employment, and that was it. And they don't know those people, and they're not comfortable with those people, but they're the people who typically investigate, because we don't want, and we don't have, and I tell them, it's not your role to investigate. Investigation is a specific process. It needs to be as independent as possible. It needs to be as unbiased as possible. It needs to engage in the same patterns every time we do it. There are those that are trained to investigate, and that's who we have to do that. And let's face it, if you're the supervisor and you say, well, I looked into it and I determined there wasn't anything, well, they're going to accuse you of bias. So you don't want to be in that situation. You want to report it on where it needs to go. So, I need to, sorry. I gotta make a change. I only have so many ports on these little computers in there. This next video that I'm gonna bring up is all about sexual harassment. They do a really great job of addressing the issue head on, and it'll re-emphasize a lot of what we've already just talked about, but it will also does it in is an enjoyable way or whatever. The grandma filter, because I used to always use the example, you know, would you say something if your actions were going to be on the 6 o'clock news? Would you say that, or how would you feel if someone said that to your spouse or to your teenage son or daughter? If your reaction is it would be inappropriate, then it doesn't belong at work. But the grandma filter is a great way of getting that across. So now you get to do the test, and you get another big test now. So what about Arnold, who's disabled, and he's not allowed by a manager to attend an out-of-town conference because the manager believes that travel to and from the conference would be too difficult due to his disability. Is this potentially discriminatory behavior?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. All employees have to be provided the same opportunities to participate and engage in all things related to their work. And we need to look, obviously, first off, whether there's reasonable accommodations we can provide to allow them to do that. Some of that's things that we can't control, but in most cases, there are means for anyone to travel and do those things these days. So he should be given every opportunity to do that. What about Frank? Frank is a war veteran who was injured in the line of duty. He's now confined to a wheelchair. His supervisor has made a number of disparaging remarks about the quality of his work and has had to speak to him about frequent tardiness and violations of city dress code. Do we have any type of unlawful harassment? No. Just because someone falls in a protected class doesn't mean that we don't address workplace issues or problems or performance issues. All those are things we expect all our employees, regardless, to meet those obligations. How about John? He's a 24-year-old Caucasian male. I love the way you have to do this, but I have to make sure we cover where people fall into categories here. He complains that his female supervisor frequently touches his arm when she speaks to him, makes suggestive comments. He denies that he's ever flirted with her or done anything to encourage her behavior, and he's uncomfortable. Is this unlawful harassment?
Yes.
It is a maybe. This is kind of where what comes to how suggestive are the comments. If it's just, well, she's always touching my arm and that makes me uncomfortable. Is that sexual? No. Is this someone who likes to, who maybe went to one of those classes where they said, oh, the way to make sure someone focuses on you is to touch them? Because that way, there are classes where they teach. Maybe that's what they've been told. If you'll touch them on the shoulder, reach out, then you get their attention. A lot of educators are taught this with children, to touch them, make sure they give you eye contact. Maybe she's just doing a bad job at how she's trying to interact. But clearly, he's offended by it. He doesn't want to be touched. She needs to understand she shouldn't be touching him. And then depending upon what actually is being said, then we may or may not have a broader issue. A coworker in Jill's department has called her an idiot because she failed to deliver an urgent message to their supervisor. Is this harassment? No. Yeah, we really shouldn't call our coworkers idiots, but it's not based on any type of protected classification or characteristic, but it is an example of how inappropriate, uncooperative, not working together and being respectful of each other creates workplace divisiveness. What about a supervisor who tells the only female in the department that I'm not assigning you any overtime because I know that, you need to be home in the evenings with your family. And my men, they really need the extra pay because they're the breadwinners and they've got to make sure they provide for their family.
Yes.
Yeah, we got a serious problem there. And this, I originally had this to give you options, so, supervisor's right that the woman's place is in the home, they should understand he's trying to be helpful. Or, yeah, there are a violation of policy. There are those, if there's any woman here as old as me, who probably has known someone or heard something like this at some point in their life. This wouldn't surprise me at all. This is wholly unacceptable today. Another thing that we always make sure people know who are in hiring capacities, you don't get to ask questions like, well, what are you doing about childcare for your children when you work? You don't know how many women, when they first started entering the workforce, would get asked, well, what are you going to do about childcare? It's none of your business. You know, you need to report to work at 8. We stop working at 5. Is that a problem? No, okay. It's not your concern what they do. It might be, I guess, child welfare if they like lock the kids up in a room, but you know, it's not your concern as an employer. An employee complains about a coworker's use of ethnic slurs and offensive comments that are all as part of, you know, jokes in the workplace. What do you think? Do you think that you need to say, well, yeah, these are violations of our policies? Would this be a situation where we need to say, well, let's see if maybe you're the only one who is finding this offensive? Or should we say that because these, you know, weren't meant to be offensive, again, the Sheldon syndrome, you know, you just need to, you know, that was your poor attempt at humor, but you need to not take offense by it.
Grandma says it's a problem.
Grandma says it's a problem, and it doesn't matter that this person who's complaining doesn't fall into the minority classification if they don't. This is someone speaking up and doing what they should do, and in many cases, it might be that those minorities are afraid to speak up. So they're doing what they really should do, which is speaking up for those who aren't doing it for themselves. An employee tells you that she and another manager were involved in a romantic relationship, and when she ended it, the manager became angry with her, and they have copies of emails and texts where they've said, basically, I'm going to make your life difficult, I'm going to make work difficult for you if you don't re-engage in this relationship with me. Is this a problem?
Yes.
And what this really is that we started off with what arguably was a consensual workplace relationship, right? She says that were in a romantic relationship. She's not saying right now it was unwelcome or unwanted. She will later. But she's not saying that right now. But, you know, we don't know that we had sexual harassment to start with, but the behavior of threatening or intimidating or threatening work reprisals because she wants out of that relationship is absolutely inappropriate, and it is retaliatory in many ways. So that is not acceptable. What about Sasha? She's a refugee from an Eastern European country, and supervisor loves to give everybody nicknames. You know, everyone's got some kind of nickname that relates to something about them. And because she wears her, you know, headscarf all the time, he's decided to coin the nickname Babushka for Sasha. And you got a problem with that?
Yes.
Yeah, you know, and we're a long way from, for instance, everybody remember, again, you gotta be old. Do you remember pull-up jokes?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, well, we don't tell any of those anymore, okay? That would be inappropriate. So doing anything, telling a joke or referring to someone in a way that calls attention to their race, their religion, their national origin, any of that is obviously not appropriate in the workplace. And we fall into that again. You know, while he might give a nickname to everyone and there wasn't an intent to be discriminatory, the bottom line is that one clearly is based on her national origin or something about her culture. And therefore, it can become discriminatory even though that wasn't the intent.
Would that also cover the generic term Bubba?
So far, hillbillies aren't in a protected class. I'll get there. You know, I say this all the time. And I come from I have a lot of good Eastern Kentucky stock here. So, but, you know, but would it be appropriate? Should we pick on somebody like that? No, we shouldn't. What if the same manager who had the babushka nickname calls Casey, Crazy Casey? Is that discriminatory?
I think so.
Yeah, I think
Well,
so.
you know, you wouldn't think so, would you? But you know what? This is one of the really dangerous areas that we tread into. We forget about disability discrimination. And if someone has a mental disability or condition of some type, which may not be open or obvious or at all, if you constantly refer to them with this nickname with no intention whatsoever related to this, it could still be perceived by that person as being discriminatory. That you are regarding me as having a mental condition, or I have one, and you may not know that, but I'm assuming that you suspect or you know that. And the next thing you know, we have a disability discrimination claim. I have had cases where there's been a disability discrimination claim, and when I first asked my employer what disability was, they didn't know. It had never been disclosed, it had never been, no accommodations had ever been requested, but they were claiming an employment action taken against them was based on the fact that they had a mental disability. So they did not win that case. It's a reported case, so it's out there. But it's very strange to say there's been discrimination and no one knows the basis why. This can be a very unknown and difficult area. So, is it okay to discriminate against a 60-year-old employee in favor of a 50-year-old employee because everybody's over 40? No. It doesn't matter. If the age is still a factor, if the fact that someone is older was a factor against them, it doesn't matter that everybody involved was over 40. So that is true. And we already talked about it. If a victim asks someone to keep secret their complaint, then we are supposed to honor that request. We have to be certain that we cannot make that promise. We need to inform the appropriate chain of command to address that. And, remind them, I am going to keep this in confidence. I'm only going to tell people who need to know, but you need to let us address this. So that is a level of confidentiality. What about changing the work assignments of an employee who's recently made a complaint to the it's supposed to be EEO? Could that be seen as retaliation? Absolutely. So those are some of the things that we look at when we're talking about retaliation against an employee. Were they an excellent employee, perfect evaluations, everything was great, now all of a sudden you're writing them up, or they're getting poor evaluations, or I was on first shift, now I'm going to second shift. Those are things that can be evidence of possible retaliation against someone for engaging in protected activity. So, there we go. So there's some of the things that can fall into the area of retaliatory types of conduct. Now, related to that though, it is really important that it doesn't mean that we never get to discipline someone because they made a complaint. And, the extreme other side of the spectrum is sometimes you have employees that are suspicious they're about to get in trouble or lose their job, and they want to file a complaint. Because if I file a complaint, you can't fire me, because that means retaliation. And that's not true. I mean, if you have a legitimate basis for dealing with discipline or termination, it should be done. But this is where the attorney and the HR monitors come back. Hopefully, as a supervisor, things have been documented, things have been properly reported, and it's clear that you're taking action based on workplace conduct, not based upon the fact that they've made a complaint. In my experience, usually there's already documentation because that's why they made the complaint, was to try to forestall the action. So we're just continuing that process. So I don't want folks to feel that it means that now we can't do anything. It doesn't mean that. But we always need to be conscious that people aren't taking actions for inappropriate reasons. So we encourage all of our supervisors in particular to be effective and watchful. It's important that they pay attention, that they are observant, not only that they don't engage in discrimination or harassment, but that they are watchful that others aren't. As a supervisor, that's part of their job. it's part of all of our jobs is to make certain that people aren't being subjected to inappropriate behavior. And it's not acceptable to say, well, I saw that, but nobody complained about it. If we see it, it's still a problem. We still need to address it. So we want to encourage appropriate workplace behavior. We want people to work together in constructive manner, to respect our differences, and that everyone brings something to the table if they are different. If we were all the same, we really wouldn't accomplish much, because we wouldn't be challenged to think differently or to look at things differently or to take a different view or opinion. Think before you speak. I always say, we kind of go back to that, you used to be the book, Everything I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Keep your hands to yourself, be polite. I mean, we need to do that. We need to go back to some of those basic rules of how we deal with each other in the workplace. So, and hopefully we eliminate to the best of our ability, even recognizing we have some level of unconscious bias, generalizations or stereotypes about those that we work with. It is a top-down mentality. What? Hit one too many there, sorry. It definitely comes from the top. If employees see that management and those above them treat people respectfully, they listen, they will take a complaint, they will address a complaint, things are managed, then they know how things need to proceed, they know how they need to act, they know that inappropriate behavior will be dealt with, and they know that they can make complaints that are valid and appropriate, not just griping, but valid and appropriate. And when we encourage that we all work together in a positive and effective work environment, then it comes all the way down through the organization. So, does anyone have any questions about?
I have a question. I've been known to stick my foot in my mouth so far I can taste my socks. So what do you do in a situation like that? What should be your immediate?
If you feel like you've made a statement
Yes,
and
ma'am.
you didn't mean to, I
Right.
think owning that statement and acknowledging that I'm sorry, I should not have said that, that was inappropriate. I apologize, I didn't mean to be offensive. Now that having been said, someone can't, I used to have one of my examples being, what if someone, if every time they're getting ready to say something that's a little on edge, they say, now, I don't mean to offend anyone, but, you don't get to, preface things to excuse them. And while we want people to acknowledge and apologize for their behavior, if someone's apologizing every day for their behavior, then we have a problem. So,
how is it perceived if on a single incident, say, a male made inappropriate flirting gestures toward a female coworker, and that female coworker spoke up like it says do, uncomfortable with that, don't like it, don't do it again, and that person ceases, desists, and never does it again.
and that's not correct.
I'm just
Yeah.
curious. That's been my general perception in the
Now,
past.
if they grabbed this person sexually or
Yeah,
something,
that's
that's
different.
different.
That's different.
But it's kind of like I said, at work, no means no. You kind of get that, you get one get out of jail free card, is the way I would put it. Yeah, and the reality is, we do spend our lives at work. I mean, think about how much of your life you spend at work. And it is not unusual, nor can we anticipate or ever expect that coworkers won't date each other, won't marry each other, won't, it happens. I mean, we are there, we meet people. The difference is at work, when you say, I'm interested, or you want to go out, when the person says, no, I'm not interested, then it stops.
That's it.
And I started laughing because I went back to the Sheldon video. And in both of these examples, Sheldon comes back to apologize to the human resources person. When he does, he brings her a copy of Alex Haley's movie Roots. He says, it's very obvious that you don't know your history. So here's a gift for you to study. So you gotta be careful, you come back to apologize, you gotta make sure your apology
And you
doesn't
offended
offend
again,
someone.
right.
Yeah. I started
Yeah.
laughing like that.
That definitely, and
Sheldon-
you're right,
Sheldon
we've
is-
forgotten about that. Yeah, I
Sheldon's
do
my
remember
brother,
that,
so I
yeah.
gotta forgive me, but-
Well, and my question is, how do you educate the clueless?
Well.
Because
Part of that is trying to do education, trying to do training, trying to do that, and there's a point at which if they won't learn, then they
falls in
suffer
the
the consequences.
Something falls in
Discipline or loss of job. I mean, that's where it has to go. There's a point at which clueless cannot be a perpetual excuse.
Yeah.
You have to conform your behavior.
Team environments also lead toward an improvement of the clueless too.
Yeah, it does help.
I want to go back to the judge's question. So wouldn't context be important in that? Like, for
Context is
example-
always important.
Right, so if an individual had a history of being sexually inappropriate and did it one time to this woman, but then what, do you understand
Yeah, I
what
mean,
I'm
and there's
saying?
always scenarios, and so for instance, I would say as in this field, we don't ever not keep records of things, but you know, asking someone out is not sexual harassment at all. So if I've asked 20 women to work out, but none of them go out with me, that's still not sexual harassment. I may just be trying really hard to find a date, but I'm not getting anywhere. So it becomes context. It becomes was there comments made, was there behavior, was there, and the fact that it's not strictly, well, we look at this one and then this one and this one. If there's a pattern of behavior, that can be an issue.
I think it goes back to what you said as well, is that if nobody has spoken to that individual in the past about the behavior, and it continues, but then you
Right.
expect, you know, I guess there's
And that is
instances.
beyond it. There needs to be a point at which someone has said, that's not acceptable, stop.
Right.
And then that person continues in that behavior.
Yeah, if it continues that point, but I mean, yeah, I mean,
Which is why
I've had to
people-
deal that with it in my own business or whatever.
Which is why we want people, please, to speak up, because we need to know
Right.
about those things.
And I don't wanna be a stickler, it's interesting that we're having this whole conversation, and we watch a video, clearly inappropriate comments, but we all laugh at it.
Yeah.
And, I mean, we know it's wrong, but yet we're still laughing at it, but, so.
Well, but I think we're laughing because we realize how absolutely offensive and insane the situation is, not that we would engage in it. And it is one of the reasons I like that video, because it makes the point with humor.
But-
And these are hard discussions, and no one likes to have these discussions.
Agreed, but I think a lot of times, I think you might have just commented on this, that sometimes when we're uncomfortable, laughter is part of something that we do. And so, you know, during certain incidents, if it may seem like we're laughing at an incident, but it's actually a reaction to the fact that we're
Yeah.
uncomfortable about what's happening.
It doesn't mean that it was welcome behavior.
Or that we approve of it.
Right, that is true.
I mean, and that's kind of what my example of is with the Sheldon video. It's kind of like, you know, really.
And people may laugh to get along and go along, even though they're offended. Because they think, well, I'm the only person who's offended, I'm not gonna go, I can't believe you said that, everybody else is laughing at it. But that person is the person who, ultimately, we often find, gets to a breaking point where they go, I'm not gonna tolerate this behavior anymore, and now they're gonna make a complaint. And that's okay, and they should.
Right.
But then it becomes, okay, the complaint isn't that this employee made one inappropriate comment. The complaint is you've been making lots of inappropriate comments, it's just that no one's been saying stop, and you shouldn't have been making any of
The
those.
firm takeaway is education. And I think that's what we're getting here, to make sure that those that are in charge are educating the people that are bringing issues forward. Whether it's firsthand or secondhand, it needs to be addressed.
Yes.
So, thank you.
But our non-examples are sometimes the best teaching examples that one could use.
Well, I mean,
Non-examples stick with us.
I like the Sheldon video, because I've done this for so many years, and I like the Let's Get Honest video very much, because some of the training videos were just horrible. I mean, number one, they weren't very real world, and a lot of times, I didn't agree. So I'd be getting this canned thing, and it would be like someone said, gee, I'd really like you to go out with me, you know, Friday night for this, whatever, and they'll go, well, they shouldn't have asked you that. Well, yeah, you can ask someone out at work. When she said no, then you couldn't. So and they were stiff, and they were fake, and they were, you know, and they do a great job to me of showing some real world examples of what actually goes on in the Let's Get Honest video. And while Sheldon is an extreme parody, God help us, I hope he's an extreme parody, that no one has done that, and I say that, but there's probably someone somewhere who's done something like that. But he's used as an extreme example, but And part of what makes, for me, the video is not only did he offend on gender, offend on sexual harassment, he offended on race, he offended on, I mean, and then he coupled it at the end with that Rajesh, it was okay for him to make that comment because he's brown too, which goes back to, no, it isn't okay. So it's the idea that somehow you get a pass or an excuse on behavior in certain cases, and you don't. So everything is wrong about that video, and it is hard. People don't like being preached, and what you feel like when you're doing some of this, you're saying this is what, and I want people when they're being trained to really be able to acknowledge what we're talking about. So that is, it's an example to help say this is what's wrong and this is what we don't do. And even though we might laugh about it in that scenario, it's inappropriate. And laughter can be a cover-up for uncomfortableness.
You said that HR departments should do the investigation. Through your practice, how well do you find that HR departments are prepared to do this type of work? And if you find them not to be very prepared, how do they get prepared?
There are ways to get prepared. There are courses on investigations. There are, there's good directives on how to do that. Some HR departments are very well organized for that. They have HR professionals that have significant training in the HR field. Others do not. It depends on what we're dealing with. And we encourage typically HR to be the source for investigations because ultimately they answer to someone in the organization, but they are a little bit more independent in their stature. When we have claims or complaints against people who rank very high in the organization, we tell folks sometimes they need to consider whether they go to outside investigators. Our firm does outside investigations. We have former HR professionals that we work with who do HR or workplace investigations that are out there that who engage in that, because sometimes you don't want anyone to question whether even HR had a bias because of their position in the organization. Sometimes, if I had the president of a company accused of inappropriate behavior, there isn't anyone in that organization who won't at some point be questioned whether they were biased, because ultimately that's the president. So you send it to an outside independent entity, and that's for the benefit of everyone. I mean, that would be the argument I make to people, whether you're accused or the accuser. It's best that we send it to this party, because that way everyone feels comfortable that we are approaching this from an independent, non-biased perspective. And that's part of the goal too. We want people to feel that they genuinely were heard and understood. Large enough organizations sometimes have most of our institutions of higher education have an EEO office. Someone can go straight to that person and make a complaint, and that's what their sole purpose is, to deal with those things. But there's such huge organizations that they unfortunately have a regularity to justify someone in that sole position. Size has a lot to do with what you can manage.
Yeah, and kind of tied into that question is, to me, one of the real difficulties with sexual harassment is for the victim to, kind of the question that resonates in my mind is, who do you tell and who can you tell and feel safe in telling that? Because it takes great courage to come out.
For a victim, it does.
For a victim.
It does.
To come out and tell someone, and who can they tell and how can they tell and feel safe in doing that?
And we want to encourage them to give us the information we need, but recognize we need to respond to it. And sometimes I'm asked, well, what if they won't tell me anything? Once I tell them, I might have to tell someone else. Well, we have follow-up, and we try to find out more, and we're more vigilant, and we're more observant, but we can't make them tell us. But hopefully they do. I had a case a number of years ago where indirectly the complainant the employee was having a dispute with the employer. They had been reprimanded for inappropriate conduct previously involving this individual who'd made a complaint. And the conduct had corrected itself. And this is like 20 years ago, so it probably wouldn't be treated quite the same today as it was then. But when the person came, they'd made the standard, I don't want them to know I made a complaint, I just want it to stop. Well, the person was reprimanded, the behavior stopped, they followed up, they knew it quit. He knew who made the complaint, but she was never identified. When he got sideways later with the employer, he complained that they fabricated the sexual harassment complaint. So the information had to be brought forward. So now he knew who she was, and her attorney moved to take her deposition. And it was it was a good experience for me, not for her. I'm just saying, it was eye-opening to me to see the impact on her and how very distressed she was. And this was a case where the person would come up behind her when she was at her work desk and would like put their hands on her shoulder, but then he'd tend to drop his hands toward her breast, or if he put his arm around her, his hand would land on her breast. And it happened enough that she realized this is intentional, it's not errant, you know. And it was really, really hard for her, very emotionally distressing, to say, this man would put his hand on my breast. It's really easy for me to say that, okay? That son of a bitch I could say that in a heartbeat. It was so hard for her to say that a man who was not her husband had laid his hand on her breast. But it's important for people and women like me to understand how hard it was for her, how hard it is for a victim, because I'm not going to be a victim, because I am that person who's going to give you the swift uppercut, and they know it. And sometimes, though, that makes it harder for us to understand what it's like for the person who has been a victim.
Well, and that's
Because we don't come from the same perspective.
Right, and that's my point, because I think there, as we started with, our biases come screaming
Sure.
out that you must have asked for it, you
Why
dressed,
didn't you
you
just
dressed,
tell them off?
you
Why
dressed
didn't
in a
you- yeah.
flirty way, you must have encouraged it, and sometimes I think women can be harder on other women
Yes.
in believing that story
Mhm.
than men sometimes. But I think that it's to me, that becomes the great challenge, is who can you tell and how can you
Right.
tell?
And that's why-
And there's oftentimes a big delay, and then we get into
Yes.
people having concerns about the big gap in the time frame that exists
Yeah, why
between
did you wait so long?
recognizing what
Mhm.
actually has happened to you.
And all of that are issues that we deal with. There's no question.
And also, if a behavior is acknowledged, recommended, all of that is accepted by all parties, what,
It's not
It should
always
not be-
accepted by all parties,
Well,
I'm just gonna say that,
if
but
the
we
behavior
hope it is.
stops, it's all documented.
I mean, I've
basically,
had
case
people who
closed.
said, they did this, they needed to be fired. Well, it wasn't a fireable offense. It was inappropriate, it shouldn't happen, they've been reprimanded, but it wasn't fireable. But someone still insists that they have to be fired. So we don't always have agreement, but we want to try to get there. We want to try to get to where people are gonna, be able to go
Right.
forward and not have a problem. But
So that should not be discussed anymore. I guess legally, I'm asking,
And when you
sort of
say
like a case
discussed
closed
anymore,
kind of thing.
discuss anymore, I mean, we don't ever want to discuss those sorts of complaints beyond those who need to know.
Right.
Because these are people. I mean, as a victim or even someone who's accused, they have a level of right, not, but particularly before there's even a finding or an investigation, to have information out there. Things may or may not be what they're accused to be. And I think we should be respectful that's personnel information as far as I'm concerned, and we don't just share that. That being said, like, there should always be a record of it, because going to the point that was here, we would never want someone to come back 2 or 3 years later and make a similar complaint and then treat that in a vacuum, because we need to know if there's been prior behavior. So like the old days when we used to say with a lot of, and this goes to any disciplinary action, well, if you've behaved for like 2 years, we remove documentation from your files or things like that. We don't do that anymore. We keep track of everything, because you don't want to be ignorant of what happened before. But we shouldn't keep talking about things. Now, we should go back to someone 30 days out, 60 days out, and say, is everything okay? Are there any problems? Are you doing all right? Everything going well. We want to make sure that to the extent we've said, this won't happen, or we've made changes, or that's being maintained and honored and kept up. But,
That's right.
yeah.
This is gonna sound funny, but I'm very serious when I say this. Do you feel like the crude, socially unacceptable, dysfunctional family of the Bundys, married with children, blurred the lines of acceptable social norms?
You know, I'm gonna have to tell you, this, I never watched that.
There's probably a reason why.
I know it was offensive on many, many levels of things. So I don't know, but see, I would kind of go back to when I said we have to look at society and culture when we determine what's reasonable and what's not. You know, George Carlin got in trouble for using 7 words
Yeah, right.
that you hear all the time on TV every night now, okay? So things change.
It's just different time.
It's moving the scale.
Yeah, I mean, if I turned on the TV in 1980 at 8 o'clock, what I saw at 8 o'clock on TV versus what I would turn on the TV and see at 8 o'clock today are worlds apart. And if you had displayed that in the 80s or the 70s, or it would have been, people would have been aghast. It would have been an outrage and an outcry. So, I mean, the things that we advertise today. I mean, you know, there was a time when we never would have advertised feminine products. We do that all over the place now. Or we do, I mean, things are different. It's different. And some of it might be good. You know, maybe it's good we acknowledge that, you know, we no longer, you know, tell women to go in the house and not come out for 5 days or whatever it is they used to do. You know, but we, yeah, and that's good. And yet it also means that we talk about, we acknowledge, and everybody has that, you know, there's good and bad that comes with every bit of progression, I guess. But I think, and that part of this is personal, I think some of it's gone too far. I wish we didn't have as much of what we see. I'm sure there are people who would disagree with me, but then that affects what's culturally acceptable and what the standard of a reasonable person is in society.
Keep young kids confused though.
Yeah.
The young folks are confused.
Having said that, how can lawmakers legislate or try to legislate this type of issues?
Well, the reality is that the legislation is fairly straightforward. We don't discriminate on the basis of gender, sex, you know, it's there. It's the case law that generates, as these things get litigated, and the regulatory schemes that come that help give us the guidance on what is and is not acceptable. And so the regulatory guidance has changed and been revised, and it goes on, and as case law happens, it tells us what is and is not acceptable. I could pull a decision from 20, 30 years ago where they said there was no harassment, and if I read you the same facts today, you'd go, oh, that absolutely was harassment. So, or I could pull something about, you know, statements or comments that would have been ghastly 30 years ago, and now today they would go, well, that you hear that on the street everywhere, and in a song, and on TV, so we're not gonna say that that's offensive. So we really are guided more by the case law and the regulatory scheme than we are the actual law itself. Because the law itself, other than adding things to it, has not changed. You know, we started off with certain things, we've added disability, and we've added genetic information, and there are things that have been added. Oh, and it used to be, remember, the Vietnam era Veterans Act that permitted discrimination, because that was our reference. And we had so many Vietnam vets that suffered such terrible behavior and discrimination when they returned from their service. But now it's veterans. We're clear it's all veterans. Now we're back to lots of veterans in our workplace who I think hopefully are being treated much better than our Vietnam veterans were. But so those things change. But what constitutes the discrimination is based on what we are currently seeing in the law. And it's not always easy. And since I see a center thing over here, you know, with our colleges and universities, we're dealing with Title IX, which is kind of like Title VII and all this on steroids. And it's been very, very hard. And they have issued massive regulations and then taken them all away. And you know, I'm a defense attorney. I would argue our institutions have become a police force, and I don't know what else. So it's gone insane. But so the pendulum swung very far one way, and now the pendulum is making a swing back. But our institutions are monkey in the middle that is going, what do? Someone tell us. I had a partner this morning arguing in the Sixth Circuit on a Title IX case involving the University of Kentucky, and will tomorrow argue another case out of them. And they all have to go with, all of our cases were first respondents who were accused that were complaining about due process, and then we have complainants complaining about whether or not they get the result they want. And part of the argument is, you all have left us hanging. You need to tell us what is and is not acceptable, because it doesn't matter what we do, someone is going to complain. So you've got to decide what it is our obligations are, tell us what we do, and if we cross those check marks off, then people don't get to bitch and complain about us. Because with everything, in most cases, there's, everything that goes to court, and that's kind of what we do with Title IX, there's a mini court. Someone wins and someone loses. And everyone who loses can't get to sue us. But that seems to be what's happening. So it's hard, it's a difficult time. I guess the good thing is it's a high employment time for people like me. That it's a difficult time.
Casey, on behalf of the group, thanks for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks.